Hello, and welcome to another edition of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong AI, the home of precision guided selling. And today, I'm really lucky to be here with Kevin Lehman, who's BDR Manager at PandaDoc. Kevin also in his part-time is a meal server and a fruit harvester, which we probably won't have time to get into. He did report to me last time that those skills aren't extremely current. So if for those of you who aren't familiar with PandaDoc, they make really cool proposals and also create, manage, and track e-sign, that sort of thing. So I do love Kevin. Welcome to the show, by the way.
Thanks, Brian. Excited to be here.
So I'm thinking about this segment as like competing in the new economy. Stuff has changed, and we were talking about market shifts, and we were, all of us kind of know we were finishing each other's sentences. It's 2x versus 6x pipe, committee buys, longer deal cycles, lower win rates. But we both started talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is something to help us compete, which is leading the customer's decision, which is likely broken, their decision process versus understanding it. So we're going to get into that in a moment. But my first question for you has to do with something you mentioned as we were talking about all these market shifts. You were wondering how much of the difficulty in doing deals is wrongly blamed on external factors, and maybe there's things internally. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought exercise. If we look back at the last few years, right, we can't discount what's going on with the economy, making money tighter and all of that. But
Yeah,
I also think when there's these big macro shifts, it helps uncover that what we were doing maybe wasn't really logical or best practice from what we were taught, or the fundamentals of selling at the end of the day. And so I think, right, it's kind of easy to blame the economy and all of that, but I think we also have to be accountable to ourselves and the quality of work that we're doing. And I think that's one thing that has really stuck out to me is just like, from a logical perspective, right? if
yeah,
if we're thinking through what's a good experience for our prospects and customers, is it really mass blasting out hundreds of emails all talking about our product, our solution, how
mm,
we're the best, which clearly isn't biased at all, by the way, right? And none of our focus is on them, right? And I think that's something that we have to be accountable for, where the idea that we can just only talk about ourselves, only celebrate our accomplishments. If you were doing that with a friend, you wouldn't really have that friend for too long, right? So I think it's a interesting thought experiment, because I always like to think of things just like in a logical way, and try and incorporate psychology in there. And really, if you look back at what was commonplace over the last 5 years, and hopefully some of that has started to shift a little bit, but it really doesn't make sense. And so I think, when thinking through, only a limited percent of your market is really, in the market for your solution right now. There's
yeah,
only, I think it's like 2 or 3%, right? And sure, what we are doing might work for them, but for that vast majority, that 97, 98%, just talking about us, just talking about our accomplishments, our achievements, the companies that we work with, it's just not really going to work.
yeah.
And so I
But I
think
think,
that's something.
yeah, and Kevin, I think overall, just that lens, right? Looking through the lens of, okay, let's stop blaming it on, tight money or anything else. I think that's really helpful. So when the thing that we morphed into is talking about this kind of one aspect of selling, which is leading versus simply understanding. Many of us were taught in the past, what is the customer's decision process, and we were talking about, yeah, that just doesn't work anymore. Give me your view on that. Like, define that a little bit.
Yeah. So I always come back to understand, or trying to understand, where the buyer is at in their view of you. I think of it as the buyer's journey, right? You're going to have people who have a very good understanding of your product, your solution. They could be actively evaluating you. You also have people that have never heard of you before. And you have to treat those people completely differently
Yeah.
in terms of the messaging you're using and all of that. So I think it's just trying to have that awareness that just because you may think that you're a bigger name in the market, not everybody is going to have a good understanding of who you are or what you do. And really, you have to kind of focus everything around that. Is that should be almost like the beginning if you're trying to reach out to an account, like just get a base level understanding or a point of view of, do they even know who we are, right? Do they
Yeah.
know that they have a problem that we can solve? I think
Yeah.
that from there starts to give you a line of questioning and give you a perspective on how to approach an account.
And yeah, I agree. And it struck me when you said that because now I'm in a situation of selling something that's new. And before I was in a situation of selling something that everyone understood. And you're right. It struck me when you said that it's a completely different frame. So, uh, customers are struggling with decisions. And when we talked about moving reps, and we'll talk in a moment about like what tools and support they need to be able to make this shift, and we talked about reps moving from understanding customer decision to leading it and providing insight. You talked a little bit about the confidence reps need to be able to make that shift, which I think it's a big behavior change. I think the core of selling is, what is the customer's decision? Yeah, so talk a little bit about that confidence shift and maybe what helps them make that shift.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. The team I manage is in the BDR world, right? So it's a lot of folks who are maybe a little earlier on in their selling career, right? And when they're approaching these larger companies, there's almost the tendency to think that they know more than we do, right? You're going to a director, VP level person, they're very experienced, right? They have a good understanding. They work at this awesome company. They must know what we do and all of that, right? In reality, we take up such a small percentage of their brain, and they might not have any expertise in your product domain at all, right? And I think just almost flipping that mindset a little bit where you spend so much time doing this, right? Evaluating if companies are a good fit for you. You have a good understanding of who your customers are, what industries particularly benefit from your solution. And I think that can't be lost in the grand scheme of things when in reality, such a small portion of their day is dedicated to this. So I think it's
It's
a little
yeah,
bit just like reframing your mindset a little bit,
yeah.
at, at least to start.
It's so important, and you and I were talking about the difference between like a veterinarian and a neurosurgeon, right? That customers are veterinarians. There's different critters walking into their office all day long, the different stuff that they're buying. Where neurosurgeons, and maybe a spinal neurosurgeon, it's like I'm an expert at this thing, and that's what we are, right? We understand. We've watched a lot of people buy and implement these kind of solutions, and I think you're right to say, how do we build up the confidence in the reps to be able to know that they're bringing a lot of chops to the table. But in order to do that, I feel like we've they need some tools. So it's one thing to tell them that, but to build that confidence, they need tools. So if a rep's going to come in and basically advise a customer on the best way to make a decision to source your kind of solution, what sort of tools and weapons and insight do they need to execute against that?
I think it's a really good point because if you use that same analogy, right, the neurosurgeon, right, they are an expert in their field. And that's what gives them the credibility to go to somebody and say, hey, you have this problem, right? It's because we trust that person.
Yeah.
Could be based off their education. It could be based on in the conversation you have with them, they show their credibility. So I think from a rep perspective, how that translates out into the field is you need to have strong industry knowledge. You need to have strong product knowledge. And you need to actually do your research on the company or have talked to somebody lower level at the company. And I think with that, that gives you a little bit more credibility to go to a person at an account and say, hey, I've heard that this is going on at your company, or I read in your 10K that you're focused on these couple things, whether it's expanding to a new region, whether it's trying to grow your revenue by this amount, right? And that gives you a little bit more credibility to come in with a point of view and say, hey, right, these are clearly priorities for your company. We've been working with other companies that were going through that exact change in their business. And what they realized is they were having problems with this
Yeah.
particular part in their processes, right? Is that at all what you're seeing, right? And I think when you come in with that approach of doing your research, but also being curious, it just opens way more doors and makes the conversations flow a lot easier. And in terms of like the confidence for reps, I also think when you're trying to ask somebody who's more senior level than you for time out of their busy day, right? That's like the most precious resource everybody has, right? Is their time. If you look at anybody's calendar, it's usually pretty jam packed. So them taking 30 minutes to do a call with you and feeling like they're not going to get anything out of it, it makes it for the rep tougher to ask for that conversation in the first place. So I
Yeah.
think you have to almost frame the conversation as something that they're going to get out of it. It could be stories that similar companies have gone through. It could be sharing industry level insights about like particular processes, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully that naturally leads into your product or your solution. But I think that helps really gear up the conversation and prime it to be more successful overall. And that helps reps get the confidence to ask for those meetings.
Well, it's interesting too because you make me think about years ago the corporate executive board came out with buyers are 60 to 80% through their journey before they contact us, and Chief Sales Officer Insights came out with a report recently, a buyer study that sellers are ninth out of 10 places buyers go for insights. So we've known for years that buyers have a ton more data. We're all aware of this, but do you think have we reacted like this has been out there for have we reacted well enough? Are we giving sellers what they need to make that shift to say your role isn't what it was, right? But here's what your role is, and here's the content and the insight that you need. How well do you think we've made that transition?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I think companies
Yeah.
are starting to realize that the internal data they have is very valuable.
Yes.
And I think we've started to make this shift where you see companies out there starting to use like anonymized customer data as a resource and an insight for other companies. I think that's really a really good use of company resources because that's not really just a sales thing at the end of the day, right? That could be you need support from your marketing team. It could be you need support from an internal data science or analytics team. And I think that's where we need to head a little bit, right? Where the information that we have, we are able to, eloquently transfer it to our
Yeah.
prospective customers,
Yeah,
right?
and
And,
you yeah,
and
and you just said it though. It's distributed. The knowledge is there. If I heard you right, the knowledge is there, but it's distributed in and whether it's data or people's brains. And it's like it's corralling all of those insights and then turning those into tools and weapons that reps can use. And I quite frankly agree with you. I think the CEB report was right on. I think as they defined the role of sellers was accurate as well. But I agree with you that we haven't really made that shift. Going back to customer decision making a little bit, we talked about it, being slower and no decision on the rise. What's your perspective from kind of a frontline perspective about why are customers wrestling with decisions these days?
so the easy answer, right, is that money has gotten tighter. I think overall, what I've noticed as well, and it makes a lot of sense, is way more tech companies have popped up, right? Which means there's so much competition in technology, and that could be within your specific niche. but it also impacts, even if it's not a direct competitor of yours, you're still competing with everybody for a buyer's attention, right?
Yes.
If you're selling to a marketing leader or a sales leader, you're not just competing with your direct competitors, you're competing with everybody that sells to those people.
Yeah.
There's only so much limited time that somebody has in their day to evaluate new technology, and it's spoiler alert, it's not very much. I also think I also think there's so much overlap in how companies are describing their technology, and that technology in reality is actually very different, but we're almost kind of using the same buzzwords that don't really describe what we do. And so that almost creates some confusion for the buyer about what actually they need and what's going to solve their problem.
Yep. I think, but you put the onus clearly back on us to make that definition, and that was what we were talking about last week. Is really, and it's interesting to me. It's not helping the customer to buy your stuff. It's like helping the customer to buy and source your category. What's the way you should be thinking through this? Who should be involved? What are the criteria? How are you tying that back to your KPIs and your business results? And that's that shift that is part of that insight we're talking about. Is, yeah, you're struggling with this. Let me be that resource for you. So I'm not ninth out of 10th places you go. Let me be a resource to take some of that complexity out of your decision process and help you filter through the noise. And it's funny because I was talking to someone on a podcast a couple months back, and he said one of his competitors did that. They provided a spreadsheet, basically a weighted attribute decision matrix, to help the customer make decisions to source this category. And the gentleman I was talking to said we were out. Right. Once they did that and they were using the competitors' tools to guide their decision process, he said we were gone. So I don't think that's going to happen always, but it's a good example of how that's used. And this notion of what's the customer's buy process. Every data point in the world shows us right now that buy process is broken. Right? There's a ton of people involved. They don't know how to do it. As you point out, they don't do this very often, so they're not great at it.
100%, right? They're maybe buying this technology once every few years. We're selling it every single day. And that means that we, in some ways, know everybody on their end who will be impacted, who will be involved in the decision, right? And it could be somebody who's never bought this technology before.
Yep.
So you have to take control of the sale a little bit and realize that you have the experience there. And I think that's why the example you brought up about sending over the spreadsheet is so smart, because you're really just doing the work for them at the end of the day, right? You're making their buying process easier, and the easier you can make it, I think the more willing that they're going to become a customer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you can, and maybe other people listening. I can think back to deals that I lost for the wrong reasons. Some we lost legit, and then there's other times when it gets down to like a buyer had a focus on a criteria, right? And it's like, okay, this is like so present, and this is part of. I used to teach decision making, but this is part of it. It's like that criteria is super present in my mind. But by the way, that's not the most important one. And by the way, there's 12 other ones, and you need to be. And that's the part where I think they make mistakes. And again, we lose deals for the wrong reasons, but we don't understand and we don't lead. Yeah, this is super helpful. And one of the things that really came out for me in this discussion is this idea of, have we made the transition to leading yet? Have we changed our role? We know the buyer's role has changed, but have we changed our role? And I do fundamentally agree with you. We haven't gotten there. And I also fundamentally agree with you that that stuff exists. We just need a very prescribed effort for pulling it together and turning it into tools and weapons that reps can use. And to your point, raising their confidence about having that role shift.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, right, there's a couple other things that we can do, right? It all comes down to, in my opinion, what your training is, what your incentive structure is, how you work well with other teams internally, and then what your processes are. And I think you can really dive into each of those and start to make changes to what your current processes are, and ultimately you'll start to see that whether it's on the training aspect and just kind of training reps more so on the different stages of the buyer's journey and how to lead the sales cycle a little bit more,
Yep.
or
Yep.
make it easier for your buyers to buy from you, right? And I think that's why your point about, hey, most companies are getting 70% through the sales cycle before they reach out to you. I think that's not just a sales problem, right? That's SDRs, that's marketing, right? That's your partner team as well. So
Yep.
it really spans all go-to-market teams. And I think that there's a lot more progress to be made on that front.
Yep. Now, this has been, you've been super generous with your time, not only on this call, but in prepping for this, and your ideas. And it's just fun for me to talk about frontline tools and weapons and how are we competing in this new world, because we have a long way to go. So really, really appreciate you sharing your insights here.
Of course. Yeah, it's great to chat with you. I always like hearing different perspectives on this type of stuff. And I think the more that you can hear what others are doing, the successes they've had, the failures, it's gonna just help us move in the right direction.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I
it's great
agree.
chatting with
And
you.
yeah, and for folks who are listening, we have, about 80 podcasts, and we've got them in categories now. So if there's, whether it's, sales enablement or forecasting, it's sitting in categories. And I think you're right, Kevin. It's great to hear what other frontline professionals are wrestling with. So appreciate you adding to that body of knowledge to a great degree.
Yeah, of course. It was great to be here. I think it's all about just trying to get that 1% better on a daily or weekly basis in those different categories, right? So I think just trying to split those up and trying to continually learn in each of those different categories that's important to your role, and that's really how in 6 months, a year, you make huge changes to your company.
Yep, I agree. Thanks.